How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 69th video on the channel, and today we're going to be continuing Character Analysis by Wilhelm Reich. Last time, we looked at chapters 1 and 2, gaining an understanding of how fractured psychoanalytic technique was in its time, and how dangerous seemingly positive transference can be. Here, examining chapter 3, titled On the Technique of Interpretation and of Resistance Analysis, we build on the latter idea and examine what Reich calls chaotic situations. This is going to be a bit of a longer video, so without further ado, let's get into it. Reich begins the first section of chapter 3, titled Some Typical Errors in the Technique of Interpretation and Their Consequences, by saying that we have to distinguish between two parts of analysis. On the one hand, you have the recovery of a patient from whatever neurosis is affecting them at the moment. On the other hand, there's immunization against later relapses into illness. For now, it's on the first of these that he wants to focus, particularly when it comes to its introductory phase. This is one of the most important moments of any analysis, since mistakes made during it can often become difficult or even impossible to undo later on in treatment. When it comes to its purpose, the stage is primarily concerned with finding what Reich calls the energy source of neurotic symptoms. The nucleus of a condition, basically. However, actually getting to it is easier said than done, since the patient unconsciously sets up resistances to protect themselves from the unpleasure associated with what has been repressed. It's thus necessary to focus on making these barricades conscious to allow the patient to relinquish them. In the process, as shown here, the pair moves deeper and deeper into childhood memories that are filled with emotion. Sometimes this takes the form of remembering, other times reenactment. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter much. What Reich is actually concerned about is the ways in which treatment can fail following the release of these new elements. It's unfortunately not uncommon for analyses to become chaotic situations, where the analyst can no longer keep track of everything that is happening. These can occur for a number of reasons. For example, as we looked at last time, negative emotions can be masked by seemingly positive transference, or a relationship between the patient and analyst. In other cases, it might be that the breakdown of resistances didn't go far enough, leading to emotions or affects remaining trapped. At this point, Reich offers some examples of his own failed cases, introducing the first by saying,
In analysis, a patient who suffered from an inferiority complex and self-consciousness enacted his impotence by adopting an apathetic attitude. What's the use?
What Reich did here was repeatedly tell the patient that he didn't desire to get better, when he should have instead delved into the nature of a resistance. As our author says, there's a tendency for those who are sick to remain that way. Constantly going back to that fact helps no one. Moving on to a second case, this one seemed much more promising. The patient had recalled the primal scene of trauma at the core of his neurosis. However, his affect remained paralyzed. Even the usual redirection of emotions, originally connected to the father towards the analyst, wasn't there. As a result, he wasn't cured, even after 3 years of treatment. After giving a few more case studies as examples, Reich explains that the common thread between all of these was a mistake in the handling of the transference. In particular, they taught him that apparently good instances can easily flip into the negative, love turning into hate or disappointment. However, this isn't the only thing that he learned through them. There's also the problem of being overwhelmed by the amount of material that can be uncovered through psychoanalytic treatment, which often surfaces in ways that seem confusing. In certain cases, chaotic situations, the analyst is unable to deepen treatment with their interpretations, only finding out that the patient is going around in circles when it's too late. As Reich puts it,
In this way, the patient is able, for years on end, to use up his analytic hour without the slightest change taking place in his nature.
As a demonstration, he gives the example of a patient he took from one of his colleagues, undergoing analysis due to a number of perversions. It seemed like everything was going well, with regular interpretations and a consistent stream of material. Eventually, though, for external reasons, analysis had to be broken off. When Reich next met the patient, he asked if he really believed everything he was saying. The response was that he had to contain his laughter the whole time. the patient saw it all as a joke, which Reich believes may have been tied to a sort of narcissistic defense. With these failed cases in mind, he now sketches out the 4 characteristics that define the way interpretation fails in chaotic situations. To begin with, there are premature interpretations that try to grasp what manifests from the deep unconscious unsuccessfully. Here, the analyst is almost duped by defenses, failing to differentiate them from the underlying symptoms. Alongside this, you also get the unsystematic interpretation of meaning, which is linked to interpreting things based on the order in which they appear. How repressed material appears is not linear, and shouldn't be treated as such. Doing so only confuses those involved, and ignores the importance of the different structures and strata that organize it all. This is quite closely related to the third mistake, the unsystematic interpretation of resistances. This involves basically getting lost within the many minor resistances at play as a result of not paying enough attention to what acts as the main, cardinal resistance. The final thing he turns to now is what he describes as inconsistency, where the fact that patients have a tendency to hide previously uncovered resistances, again, is essentially ignored by the analyst. They are allowed to lay latent, eventually causing problems later along the line. All of these errors, in Reich's eyes, stem from a misapplication of Freud's rule that the course of analysis should be the patient's responsibility. Ending this section, he says that
this Freudian rule can only be taken to mean that the patient's work should not be disturbed when it is following a course in keeping with his conscious will to get well, and our intention to cure him.
Beginning the second section of Chapter 3, titled Systematic Interpretation and Resistance Analysis, Reich states that he feels like he has subjected analysis to enough criticism. Here, he seeks to actually begin answering some of the questions that he has raised throughout the last section and the prior 2 chapters. However, he starts off with a warning. Psychic events are, by definition, fluid living things. When you write about them, you make them static and artificially rigid. It's thus that any of Reich's ideas can only be taken as sketches that, inevitably, must be corrected and added to. In his own words,
our investigations of the psychic processes during treatment will be held together by similar landmarks, which will be created ad hoc solely for the purpose of orientation.
Another disclaimer that he makes is that cases are not to be approached on the basis of the rules, principles, and other such results of theory. It's necessary to go off of the material of a case itself, without any preconceived notions. Only later can theory be brought in to help tailor what techniques to apply. With this in mind, he says that, regardless, the best course of action is to hold off interpretation before the cardinal resistance has been identified and dealt with. Interpretations of unconscious meaning come after resistance interpretations. The reason why rests in the fact that, when unresolved, resistances can basically lead to the patient linking interpretations into the transference, refusing them if it turns negative. Another facet is that the unfolding of what Reich calls the analytic personality in the patient must not be disturbed at the beginning of treatment. Likewise, you can't just go straight into resistance analysis. You have to let them surface in some way or another in order to understand how to deal with them. As he says, this can take very little time for an experienced analyst, and a lot of time for an inexperienced one. When it eventually does become possible, it's time to undertake a consistent interpretation, where, first, the resistance is made conscious, then the means by which it operates, and finally, what it is directed against. It is this that is shown in this diagram. Moving on, Reich now turns his attention to the transference resistance that comes up in any patient-analyst relationship. As he says, it's difficult to get rid of when it isn't preceded by a study of a patient's past experiences. This is because, like dreams, every resistance has a certain historical cause and a contemporary meaning. Given the issues with starting with earlier material, Reich tells us that one valuable approach involves first working out the latter before moving on to the former. It is only with an interpretation of both that it's possible to completely dissolve the resistance in question. Complicating this all is the fact that there's no one way to figure out the contemporary meaning. calling it part of the non-teachable art of analysis, Reich says that it's largely a matter of intuition. As he adds,
the less blatant, the more concealed the resistances are, i.e. the more the patient deceives, the more certain the analyst will have to be of his intuitions in order to gain control.
This leads Reich to a discussion of so-called latent resistances. These are basically things that work against analysis in ways that aren't immediately apparent. Whilst being late, doubting interpretations, and so on are all manifestly resistances, completely lacking them or being docile might indicate that there are concealed ones lying beneath the surface. Reich stresses that latent resistances have to be dealt with as soon as possible, since, whilst present, they basically destroy any therapeutic value of the communication between analyst and patient. In this diagram, the one-sided result of not paying attention to them is represented like so. Quite quickly changing focuses, it's here that Reich pauses a moment to look at the Freudian idea that the analyst must proceed from what is called a specific surface. As our author explains, this has led to many catastrophic results, particularly related to what exactly constitutes the analytic material implied by specific surface. Generally, this is seen to include words, dreams, associations, and slips. However, Reich holds that things like gestures, mannerisms, dress, and so on also play an important role. These, he says, act as the fundamental starting point for character analysis, hence the name of the book. At the heart of his argument is the idea that it isn't only the content of what a patient communicates to the analyst that matters, but also the form. In his eyes, too many analysts focus on only the former, leading to all kinds of problems. As an example, he offers the case of a highly polite patient who offers much material about his love for his sister. The psychic surface includes both elements, each grounded in the unconscious. In analysis, it's necessary to proceed with both in mind, not just the content itself. In Reich's words,
we learn from analytic experience that beneath this politeness and nicety, a more or less unconscious, if not downright distrustful or derogatory attitude is always concealed.
It doesn't make much sense to interpret the other material without accounting for this character trait, which functions as resistance that must be uncovered by the analyst. As Reich relates, another theorist might object at this point that surely the status of a patient's politeness as resistance is contradicted by the fact that they still produce material. However, this actually gets at the core of his point. Again, it's not just the content that's important, but its formal characteristics as well. The patient might, through their politeness, only offer part of a story, hiding behind a multitude of repressions that molded their character. It's actually sadistic patients who are most frank during analysis, telling everything that comes to mind, especially as it comes to the transference and what they think of the analyst. Although their sadism may appear as resistance and hurt the analyst's feelings, their behavior is actually valuable in the long run. It's Reich's contention that analysis usually begins with an atmosphere of distrust, concealed may it be. To gain the patient's confidence, sabotaged as it is by the newness of a situation and the general contempt for psychoanalysis found in society, it's necessary for an analyst to be frank with them themselves. The technical question that remains concerns the point at which this should be done, since, as contemporary concerns, these resistances aren't quite neurotic. The fundamental rule is that deeper interpretations of the unconscious should not begin as long as there is this wall of feigned politeness separating the patient and analyst. Moving now towards the development and treatment of transference neurosis itself, he says that a normal analysis should meet up with it fairly early on. It's characterized as something of a reaction against the intrusion of the analyst into repressed material. It's also unconscious. It's not like the patient is actually trying to slow down their treatment knowingly, at least in general. Fundamentally, it's an irrational stirring that wants to be realized in a rational foundation, an actual relationship. Thus, there's the displacement of an unconscious content onto the analyst, usually linked to past experiences with the patient's parents. As Reich himself says,
as the disturber of the neurotic balance, the analyst necessarily becomes the enemy. whether it is a matter of projected love or projected hate, for in both cases defense and rejection are always present.
This is why positive transference can be so tricky. It conceals the fundamental transference neurosis, making it difficult for the analyst to tackle it head on. At this point, Reich seeks to outline a number of cases in which you might come across situations like this, starting with so-called good patients. They are friendly, seemingly implicitly trustful, and never show disappointment. Next, you have patients who are very strict in their manners and deeply conventional. There are also those who simply have paralyzed affects or emotions, along with those who complain about being artificial in their feelings. This latter group is described as suffering from depersonalization, although there are some who do indeed have a compulsive need to undertake what Reich describes as play acting, even if doing so tortures the patients in question. With this in mind, he explains that the transference neurosis is primarily linked to infantile experiences of love. As a result, it offers a window into the conflicts of early life that gave rise to the issues in question. In fact, Reich, following Freud, argues that this is the only way to reach the original neurosis. Because of how they interact, it's important to proceed carefully and without trying to get to unconscious strata immediately. To demonstrate this, he offers the case study of a patient who loved their mother, then hated their father, then withdrew that love and converted that hatred out of fear. Treatment has to go in reverse order, only freeing up psychic energy or libido to be attached to other people at the end of a chain. In the transference, the drama of these three stages is played out, with the analyst taking the role earlier occupied by the parent at each point. However, the situation can sometimes appear more complicated than this. If the love of a mother is manifested in dreams, whilst the supposedly positive transference has been dealt with, despite being the deepest layer, it may be tempting for the analyst to directly jump to interpreting it. However, doing so would only lead to the higher strata, the hatred of a father and its conversion into love, forming a reactive resistance to the analyst's efforts. This leads to a chaotic situation, with the patient seemingly becoming nicer in response, just to be hiding their problems even deeper within. As Reich says,
As theoretical as this may sound, it is a principle which has to be applied in every average case.
It's with this that we get to the last section of Chapter 3, titled Consistency in Resistance Analysis. Here, as the name suggests, Reich's focus is on the importance of maintaining interpretation in a systematic way. After the transference has been worked through and its latent resistances have been dealt with, treatment, for a time, proceeds very quickly. However, eventually, the patient runs into more forbidden material, requiring the game of resistance analysis to start back up again. Oftentimes, this can involve the old blockages flaring up again, leading to all sorts of strange patterns when it comes to finding out what stratification you're dealing with. For Reich, this luckily doesn't matter too much for technique itself. The central idea he's trying to get across with this section is that the old resistance acts as a valuable jumping off point that the analyst can use to slowly chip away at the new ones that pop up during the stage. To paraphrase almost directly, it acts a bit like a citadel, making it possible for the analyst to undermine neurosis from a range of different directions. If you only focus on the new stuff, you lose consistency, and thus the analysis can quickly descend into a chaotic situation. Concluding the chapter, he now turns his attention to the debate on whether an analyst should be active or passive. Reich's position, quite simply, is that you should be neither. Bombarding a patient with interpretations just makes it difficult to keep control of the situation, whereas silently waiting for things to pan out allows resistances to fester. Returning back to the Freudian rule we talked about a bit earlier, he states that the patient only really has the reins when it comes to analysis, whilst resistances aren't a problem. Going against the wisdom of many other analysts, he doesn't really consider interpretation to be the main focus. Summing up, as Reich puts it,
It can be said generally that resistances cannot be taken up soon enough in the analysis, and that, apart from the resistances, the interpretations of the unconscious cannot be held back enough.
It's with this that we get to the end of Chapter 3 of Character Analysis by Wilhelm Reich, now having a window into some of the many facets of resistance analysis and psychoanalytic interpretation. I know this was a bit of a longer video, But I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time, we'll most likely be either continuing this book or finishing off Guatri's seminar on problems. Until then, bye!